we'll go from there. So we will be recording the meeting. We usually put meetings on YouTube, and please do bear with us, and it's useful for those that attend later or would like to have a look at the talks much later. Just a quick introduction. My name is MX. I'm Xolisi Sibanda, and I lead the Zimbabwe chapter of the Society for Conservation Biology with a brilliant team that I'd like to introduce very, very briefly, so that you know them and you're able to get in touch if need be. So I'm the president, and Nobesutu Ngwenya is the president-elect, and Diane is our treasurer, and Tim is vice president. And we've been working together to just do a variety of things. We're working on a strategy. We're planning to do a horizon scan and a few other activities that many of you have contributed to until now. As part of that, we are looking for a secretary. Leo, who was our secretary, has had to resign due to other commitments related to his job. So we're opening up for applications. Please do apply. And we particularly, if you're young and want to be involved with this kind of work, please do join. We really encourage you to be a part of our team. So do go onto our website and see if you can get the links and join, or rather apply on the links provided there. We have received a few responses already, but we're opening it, keeping it open for a few more weeks in order to have more people who can join the team. We've got a website, and I encourage many of you to go into it and see what we're doing. We're part of the Global Conservation Biology Association Society, and we encourage all of you to do join as a member. Our members ought to be members of the Global Society, but we do understand that there might be constraints to some of you, particularly if you're in Zimbabwe, and in terms of Forex. Do let us know if there are any constraints that you face in joining as a member of the Conservation Biology Society. As a chapter, we're working on curating a resource library with literature, scientific and grey literature that would like to make available to our members and to the scientific community in Zimbabwe, particularly conservation community. We're also planning on a horizon scan. We've got a blog, and of course we do have this seminar series, and we would like you to participate and be a part of all that. Our blogs contain stories and ideas on Zimbabwe conservation, and if you would like to do one, please do send an email to Tim, who will be able to help get your blog online. We've already had some very exciting blogs on bird conservation, agriculture, and conservation, and we've got one on Leo's work as well, which we really look forward to, and that should be up sometime next week. Just one other plug before we go to Andrew, just to say that we've just had an announcement that the International Conservation Meeting for the Conservation Biology Society is going to be online this year. The initial dates were 12 to 16 December, but I think that might change soon, but we really encourage all of you to please be a part of that and go and register, and if possible participate as well
The sound complete.
If you are able, we really would like to encourage you to just put yourself on mute, and so that there aren't any interruptions as we go on. So just want to probably end here by saying that if you may please do sign up. We've got a list of people that are on our list and interested, who want to be friends. Please do sign up on our website, and we'll be very glad to keep you updated on what we're doing as a chapter. So having said that, I just wanted to say how excited I am and just do a quick introduction of Andrew. Andy is well known in the lion predator circles, and his group, the WILDCRUI, is even more publicly known because of Cecil the lion and the kind of work that they've done around lions, leopards, and other predators in Africa and elsewhere. He's worked in conservation research throughout the last 20 to 30 years. And he started his dance with predators working on African jackal. And since then, he has, together with David McDonald, who leads WILDCRUI, cut a path establishing a long-term study of lions in Hwange National Park. And this has covered ecology of lions, sustainable use, particularly trophy hunting, which can be quite, is widely debated, human-wildlife conflict, and landscape ecology, including the genetics of lions and how to conserve them in the wider landscape. I think I was excited to learn that lately that's expanded to look at leopards as well. And so Andrew has something to talk about, how to conserve predators in the 21st century, having covered all those things. I think in addition to that, I'm quite, confident he has something as well to say to many of us who are based in far-flung countries, but interested both as natives of Zimbabwe and scientists engaged in global topics on how to be both local and global at the same time, for good or worse. I'm sure that's something that he can talk about, and how to maintain fair and just relationships, develop capacity, maintain long-term donor interest in places like Hwange. Recently, Andrew has published a book on studying lions, and particularly Cecil the lion. It's called Lion-Hearted: The Life and Death of Cecil and the Future of Africa's Iconic Cats. It continues, particularly this whole thing about Cecil continues to generate debate on the Twitter sphere. And I'm sure lots of people in policy halls, whether the CBD, talk about that as well. And he's recently been promoted to being an associate professor for all the work that he's done. In addition to the book, he's got over 100 scientific publications, and so do go to his website and have a look at those. So just a bit of a personal touch to this for me is that many years ago, when I was a biological sciences student, honors student at the University of Zimbabwe, I had the privilege of being taught by Professor John Loveridge, a course in vertebrate biology. And John happened to be Andrew's dad. And I discovered as I was preparing that he was born in my home city of Bulawayo, and was a fantastic teacher. And Andrew does give him for his excitement and about conservation. And I was particularly excited about crocodiles, and did surveys with one of John's students, Richard Ferguson, and one of the most memorable parts of my career. And so I think John's legacy, unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago, lives through Andrew and many of us that knew him. And so I'm very excited to welcome Andrew to what I think will be a very interesting but highly relevant presentation today, the challenges of conserving predators in the 21st century. We'll have a Q&A after his presentation, but really encourage you to put on the chat any questions that you might have as we go along, as Andrew does his presentation. So without further ado, want to say thank you, Andrew. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
MX, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. So I'm going to kind of sort out some technology here, which will involve sharing the screen, but I'm going to stop my video as well, just to kind of make it a bit easier. Right, so I hope you can now see a slide. Max, can you confirm that's all there?
Yes, it is.
Okay, fantastic. Right, well, I'll make a start then. So today I'll give a talk about the challenges of conserving large predators in the 21st century. And I'd like to thank MX and the Zimbabwe SCB committee for inviting me to give this talk. It's a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity to speak at a forum in my home country, even though I'm very far away at the moment. I have a very small confession to make to start out with, and that the talk title implies that the talk will be about large predators. However, the observant amongst you will be very quickly notice that much of this talk is about lions. And this is largely because they're a species I've spent much of my career to date researching. However, many of the challenges of conserving lions are common to virtually all other large predators. So I hope you can forgive the inaccuracy of the talk title. So to give you some background, I started work on lion behavior and conservation nearly 25 years ago in Hwange National Park, when David MacDonald, the current director of WILDCRUI, and I started a research project on lions. It was largely designed to investigate the impacts of trophy hunting. This was at the invitation of national parks and concerned safari operators. Since then, the scope of the study and its spatial coverage has expanded. From gaining an understanding of the impacts of trophy hunting on population dynamics, we moved to research on ecology of lions in the Hwange system. And Hwange is, of course, very different to other areas where lions have been studied, which is mostly in East Africa. It also soon became apparent that conflict with people was a huge issue that needed to be understood and mitigated, and that prompted us to begin work in this area too. And finally, because our work showed that lion populations in this ecosystem used vast areas and required large tracts of protected land to be viable, we started to work on understanding landscape connectivity and population dynamics across the wider Khaza conservation area. We branded the larger project the Trans-Kalahari Predator Program, or TKPP, as it spans a large part of the Kalahari Basin, and to recognize that the geographical scope of the project went far beyond just the Hwange ecosystem. So to date, the project has generated over 100 publications and 9 doctorates. And in this talk, I'm going to focus on 2 particular aspects of research. Firstly, prioritizing landscape scale conservation. And secondly, understanding and mitigating human-wildlife conflict, human-lion conflict. The research I'll talk about has been undertaken by a large team of field staff and doctoral students over the years, with many hours spent in field monitoring and collecting data and in data analysis. So I acknowledge their huge efforts. And some of them are pictured, not all of them, some of them are pictured in the slide. And I also would like to acknowledge a very close collaboration we have with colleagues in the Parks and Wildlife Authority in Zimbabwe and in the Department of National Parks and Wildlife in Botswana. So most of you will know the areas I will talk about, or certainly all the Zimbabweans will. But for those not familiar with the geography, this is a map of the Kavango-Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area, or KAZA. It's a conservation area of about 500,000 square kilometers. The map shows the major lion populations within KAZA, and within those, and those in green are considered the stronghold populations. And the Okavango-Hwange population is really quite central in that. And this map shows a protected area network in the region, with the red arrow showing Hwange National Park, which I'll mention quite frequently in this talk. The research we do covers much of KAZA within Zimbabwe and Botswana, and extends beyond KAZA into other areas of Zimbabwe. So the big question might be, why do we need to conserve large carnivores? They require range states to set aside and pay to protect large areas of land to sustain them, and invariably come into conflict with people, usually over livestock depredation, but also occasionally because they pose a danger to people too. This makes them very challenging to both conserve and to manage. But why are they so important? The first reason is that they clearly have a cultural value. For instance, lions are the national animal in 15 countries worldwide, from Singapore to Sri Lanka and Ethiopia to Luxembourg, even though only 2 of those countries actually have extant lion populations. They symbolize royalty and power, and lion images are widely used by sports teams and in marketing. Secondly, they are charismatic, and they capture our attention. Most people remember the public outrage that followed the illegal killing of this lion in the photo to the right, Cecil. This attention and the public motivation that goes with it can be used to conserve the ecosystems of which lions are an integral part. Charismatic species such as lions also have significant value to economies. Foreign tourists contributed over 30 billion to African economies in 2017, with wildlife watching making up 80% of total annual sales. And of course, that has all changed with COVID. But lions are vital flagships to attracting tourists, and many tourists stating that large predators were the most attractive incentive to visit a wildlife area. And it's estimated that in Queen Elizabeth National Park in Uganda, each individual lion is worth $19,000 in tourism revenue annually. So they're a valuable commodity. This slide shows how inextricably linked is the future of large predator populations to the health of ecosystems. Lion populations, and in this case measured by their biomass, are closely correlated to prey species biomass. So without the buffaloes, zebras, and gazelles, there would be no lions. In order to conserve wild lion populations, we also have to protect the prey populations on which they rely. And this requires protection of vast areas of habitat. In other words, lions are ambassadors for the conservation of savanna, just as other large charismatic species are ambassadors for the ecosystems they inhabit. Finally, it's increasingly apparent that large apex predators are critical for ecosystem function. Historically, conservation managers heavily controlled predator numbers, including in Hwange National Park, actually, as it was thought this was beneficial to the conservation of herbivore species. However, early ecological thinkers like Aldo Leopold noticed the negative effects this policy has on ecosystems. Apex consumers play a role in top-down regulation of ecosystems. Removal of apex predators often results in trophic cascades and potentially affect ecosystem dynamics, disease transmission, wildfire currents, carbon sequestration, biochemical cycles, and many other processes. So they're really important in our ecosystems. So now we've spoken about the reasons why we should, and indeed why it is beneficial to conserve predators. What threats do they face? And I'll talk about a few of those now. So many large-bodied terrestrial predators are threatened. I think it's about 3/4 of all large-bodied predators are in decline. And this is particularly the case with African lions, which are classified as vulnerable by the IUCN, and populations have declined by as much as 47% over the last 20 years. And threats include things like over-exploitation through poorly managed trophy hunting policies, which can cause population declines. Though it should be said that trophy hunting can also be undertaken completely sustainably. And we've done a lot of work on understanding trophy hunting in our work. I'm not going to talk about that a lot today, but the papers are out there. Over-exploitation for illegal trade is an emerging threat. Lion bones are used in traditional Asian medicines as a substitute for tiger bone. 70 tons of lion bone were legally exported from South Africa to Asia between 2008 and 2017. Recent restrictions on trade may precipitate illegal exploitation, with evidence that some populations may be declining due to poaching for illegal trade. Fortunately, this has not been recorded in Zimbabwe to any great extent as yet. Bushmeat poaching, when wire snares are used to kill wild species for food, is a significant threat to African savanna biodiversity, with large predators being particularly susceptible to dying as accidental bycatch, with mortality potentially feeding into other illegal trade. And we've recently published a paper looking at kind of the impact of wire snaring across several populations in Zimbabwe. Conflicts with farmers over livestock is a significant threat to large predators. And around the world, large predators come into conflict with people, for instance, wolves in North America and Europe, lynx in Western Europe, tigers and leopards in Asia, jaguars in South America, and lions, spotted hyenas, cheetah, leopards, and others in Africa. And I'm going to talk in more depth about this issue in the context of the work we've done in Zimbabwe and Botswana later on in this talk. However, the most pervasive threat to all biodiversity is habitat loss, and particularly in tropical terrestrial ecosystems. And this is the leading cause of species extinction and population decline. Globally, forested areas originally covered about 18 million kilometers squared. Half of that has now disappeared. About 1 billion square kilometers is cleared every 5 to 10 years for timber extraction and agriculture. And in the next part of my talk, I'll touch on how we might prioritize conservation landscapes to mitigate habitat loss into the future. So for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to focus on two aspects of our research, which I've sort of mentioned before. And these are particularly pertinent to conserving lions, in my view. And the first is prioritizing habitat and landscape connectivity. And the second is mitigating human-lion conflict. So in Africa, human populations are growing rapidly, with currently around 1 billion people on the continent. And this population will double in less than 50 years to 2 billion. And this has and will continue to result in significant habitat alteration across the continent. And you can see in this photograph, this is actually Mfungabuzi Forest in Zimbabwe. You can see settlement right up to the protected area boundary, huge habitat conversion. And that's happening right across the world, but right across Africa as well. So we estimate that at the turn of the last century, there were around 200,000 lions in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's a bit of a thumbs up because no one really recorded these things in those days. Lions were considered to be extremely common. So our research, using a cutting-edge landscape connectivity model, which I'll talk about in a moment, shows that by the 1970s, lion habitats had declined by 60% from its historical extent, and populations had plummeted to less than 80,000 individuals. This map shows connected lion habitat across Africa, with dark blue colors showing highly connected and brown colors the least well-connected habitats. This habitat model shows that even though diminished from historical times, vast areas of savanna habitat, even outside protected areas, were likely still inhabited by lions 50 years ago. However, by the early part of this century, lion range and populations had severely declined, using the same analytical techniques, but with updated data reflecting the burgeoning human population and expanding clearance of wild habitats for agriculture, we find that connected habitat now occupies around 12% of its historical extent. And the most suitable habitats for lions are largely within protected areas. And much of the habitat lying outside these refuges has disappeared. Lion numbers have declined by 70% to around 23,000 individuals since 1970. And that is the loss of around 1,000 lions a year for the last 5 decades. So it's quite a catastrophic collapse in population. Declines in range and population size have been accompanied by a loss of genetic diversity, which could further imperil this iconic savanna species. The slide shows some research led by Simon Duras from ZSL at the time, looking at declining genetic diversity in lion populations across Southern Africa compared to historical times. And in this paper, we showed that genetic diversity of the modern lion population has reduced by between 12 and 17%, with a reduction in allelic diversity of approximately 15% compared to historical populations. In addition, having lost a number of mitochondrial haplotypes, we also identified a number of ghost alleles in the historical samples, which are no longer present in the extant population. The rapid decline in allelic richness after 1895 suggests the erosion of genetic diversity coincides with the rise of European colonization and the resulting declines in regional lion populations. And so what we know is that small isolated inbred populations, which is kind of what we're seeing happening at the moment in lion populations across Africa, are significantly more at risk of extinction from stochastic events, such as disease. And a study by Bjorklund et al. Shows that at least 50 prides of lions is required to maintain a population's genetic diversity. And what we see is that the majority of lion populations across Africa are likely to be too small to ensure genetic diversity. So all the populations that are in brown on this map are smaller than 50 prides. And this highlights the importance of maintaining current lion populations and habitat, and where possible, linking populations together to ensure that there is sufficient genetic exchange to ensure adequate levels of genetic diversity. And at the same time, we know that Africa is changing fast. And so we know that by 2060, more land will be required for growing crops. And it's estimated that about 430 million hectares, or equivalent to about half the area of the continental United States, will be cleared in sub-Saharan Africa for agriculture. You can see from these maps that the highest demand for agriculture in the left-hand map, with the dark colors indicating high demand, coincides very closely with lion range across Africa. And this threat of habitat loss has huge implications for the conservation of African lions. So conserving connectivity between lion populations and avoiding isolation is critical. Landscape ecology helps us to understand animal movements in the landscape and to prioritize conservation actions. A core part of the research on lions in Hwange has been to understand spatial behavior. And to do this, we've fitted well over 100 lions with telemetry GPS collars. This has allowed us to gain a unique understanding of how lions move in the greater Khaza landscape. This map shows the movement path of a young dispersing male. His movements extended far beyond the confines of Hwange National Park, and over about 18 months, he covered over 10,000 kilometers, which had he moved in a straight line, he could easily have dispersed to an adjacent national park. Other lions in his age class have done exactly that, as indicated by the arrows in the map. Young male lions naturally disperse from their natal prides between the ages of 3 and 4, and while young females tend to be philopatric, and adult males and females are strongly territorial. So once settled in a territory, they seldom move beyond its boundaries. As such, young dispersing males are the age-sex demographic most likely to be responsible for genetic exchange between populations. So in order to assess potential levels of movement connectivity across the Khaza landscape, we generated a landscape connectivity model using our GPS movement data. Each 30-day movement path, an example given as the blue line in the map, was randomized, and habitat variables from used paths were compared to statistically to those covered by random paths. You can see the randomization there. And that was actually a young male lion that moved between Hwange National Park and Chizarira. So one of our kind of long distance dispersers. Our analysis showed that dispersing young males use the landscape in completely different ways to adult females or adult males. They are less averse to moving through the farmland. They select woodland and avoid open areas, which is the opposite to what adults do. And although avoiding roads and human development, they do so to a lesser extent than adults. So using this information, we were able to develop maps of landscape resistance, otherwise known as resistant surfaces. And these depict the relative permeability of the landscape to a lion, so how a lion can move through the landscapes. In these maps, high landscape resistance is shown in red and low resistance in blue. So in blue areas, the lions can move through very easily. You can see that the landscapes are very different for young males compared to adults, with adult females and males effectively confined to protected areas, and young males more willing to traverse human-dominated landscapes. We've used this model to predict landscape connectivity in the Khaza landscape, using cumulative resistant kernels and analysis of least cost paths to predict lion movements over the landscape. And I'm not going to go into the sort of heavy detail of these models because that would be a talk in itself. But these are kind of some of the results. So the resultant cumulative resistant kernels shown in 3D on the left-hand map depict movement across the landscape by dispersing lions, with red colors and high topography showing areas of high movement probability or high connectivity, and blue colors and low topography showing low probability of movement or low connectivity. By comparing this to the map on the right, you can see that the highly connected habitat coincides with protected areas. And with wildlife areas between national parks, which are shown in green in the map, being particularly critical for maintaining the connectivity of the Khaza landscape. And if these interstitial areas are lost to agriculture, for instance, then national parks would effectively become isolated islands, which is exactly what we want to try and avoid for conserving the species. The model also allows us to prioritize areas of connected habitat that are critical to protect to ensure future connectivity. And those are those kind of interstitial areas between national parks, which you can see in the map. We turn all these areas and the protected areas that are part of that kind of core as the core lion habitat. And you can see within Khaza, in that area 1, those are the habitats between Chobe and Hwange National Park, for instance. They're really important to maintaining that kind of connectivity. This map now shows the core habitat in gray. So that's the previous map I showed you. And it takes into account the dispersal ability of young male lions. So we used this to calculate the least cost paths between core areas. In other words, routes that lions might take through human-dominated landscapes to reach adjacent habitat cores. These least cost paths are not connected habitat, but represent occasional dispersal events. These are actually quite realistic. We have collected movement data from lions that we have been able to use to verify these potential linkages between habitat cores. And actually, we're just about to publish a paper on some movements we've recorded between Hwange and Chizarira National Park in collaboration with the Alert Project. So we've prioritized these corridors according to their strength and the importance in maintaining overall landscape connectivity, with pathway number 1 being the most important, and so on. And this allows decision makers to take a look at the map and see which areas are most critical to focus conservation efforts on. So what do we do with this information? Well, if we're to avoid the most catastrophic scenarios, we need to work with conservation policymakers to plan future conservation in order to prioritize the best conservation outcomes. So we work with conservation managers to share our work and to ensure that our research is considered in future conservation planning. And these photos show meetings we've held with policymakers in Khaza countries, in this case in Botswana. And some of the prioritized corridors we've identified have already been included in spatial planning in the Botswana National Spatial Plan, which you can see at the bottom of the slide, suggesting that it's possible to influence future conservation and improve future conservation outcomes. So from talking about landscape scale conservation, I'm going to turn to a discussion of human-lion conflict, or conservation conflict as it is more commonly becoming known. Conflict has impacts on both biodiversity and human well-being, as the juxtaposition of these two images shows, with some villagers looking at their dead cows that have been recently killed by lions, and a lion having been killed by people for killing livestock. Solving these conflicts is a conservation priority. So attitudes towards a species can be a key determinant of whether there is societal motivation to conserve them. And as a highly charismatic species, lions are greatly valued by global society. And colleagues in WILDCRUI studying the effect of species charisma on conservation potential found that across 5 English-speaking countries, and that's India, UK, USA, Australia, and South Africa, lions rank 3rd after tigers and elephants in people's preferences. Of course, that was a survey that was done of people who have laptop computers. So they are maybe a different subset of people to those you might find in rural Africa. And those are the scores there. So in contrast to this, our surveys of attitudes of subsistence farmers living adjacent to Hwange National Park show that people universally dislike lions. And on a 5-point Likert scale, with 1 being deeply dislike, they, along with spotted hyenas, score on average very close to 1. In contrast, other conflict causing species like elephants, jackals, leopard, and wild dog score between 2 and 3. So disliked or neutral. And it's not very surprising because in the same survey, we found that 41% of households had been affected by predation on their livestock, of which 14% had been affected by lions and 18% by hyenas over the previous 12 months. And livestock losses are costly to farmers who are relatively impoverished. So average losses to lions sits between $150 and $200 annually. And to put this in context, annual per capita domestic income is around $600. So these are not rich people. And this represents a significant impact on livelihoods. And it likely explains at least some of the animosity people have towards predators. But it's not the whole story. And as usual, conservation is complicated. Socioeconomic surveys undertaken by WILDCRUI graduate student Kim Jacobson, who's in that picture sitting next to Lovemore Sabanda, who was one of his peers in WILDCRUI, show that while livestock loss is important in determining people's attitudes to lions, and therefore their willingness to tolerate them, other factors are equally important, such as ecocentricity, or the values that people attribute to nature, and the degree to which survey participants' fear of lions interfered with their daily activities. Equally important were whether people benefited from nearby protected areas, or whether they participated in conflict mitigation programs. So people's attitudes to lions is rather complex. Now, conflicts are equally costly for lion populations, and conflict over livestock loss very often leads to retaliatory killing of lions. So overall, humans caused about 80% of lion mortalities in the Hwange population. And retaliatory killing for livestock depredation makes up about a quarter of these. And our data show that if conflict mortalities are high, this can cause population declines. As I've mentioned, conflicts are highly complex. And one of the drivers is ecology and the behavior of complex species, which is heavily affected by the ecosystems of which they're a part. So this map shows the national park in green, with communal agro-pastoral farmland in brown, and A, B, and C show our 3 study sites. C is a site that we collaborate with the Vic Falls Wildlife Trust to run. We find that livestock is very seasonal, mostly occurring during the wet season of the year from December to April. And this is partly due to changes in prey availability, with natural prey being more dispersed in the wet months and less accessible to lions. However, we also noticed that livestock appeared to be more commonly seen close to the protected area boundary during the wet season than at other times of the year, suggesting that seasonal variation in livestock husbandry might also play a role. So to explore this trend, we fitted GPS collars to cattle in Jolocho. Typically, cows are kept in enclosures or bomas at night, close to homesteads, and they graze freely in the day, returning home at nightfall. Using GPS collars, we were able to record the locations of cattle over each 24-hour period across the seasons. And this is what we found. So this graph shows the results of the work. The left vertical axis shows the mean monthly number of cattle killed by lions. And the right axis, the mean daily distance cattle moved from their home enclosures. During the wet season, cattle moved longer distances from home, and this correlated with a higher number of livestock killed by lions. Then in the early dry season and the late dry season, cattle stayed much closer to home and fewer were killed. And this suggests that the way in which cattle are managed affects levels of depredation. So why did the cattle move further away from their home enclosures during the wet season? And it turns out this is all to do with the growing of crops on arable fields directly adjacent to homesteads. And this graph shows the mean daily distance moved on the left vertical axis and the selection for crop fields quantified using a Jacobs selectivity index on the right vertical axis. That selection of crop fields by cows. So during the crop growing season and the wet season, in the early part of the year, cattle were actively herded away from the fields and homesteads and towards the national park boundary in order to avoid crop damage by livestock. Later in the year, once crops are harvested, cattle are highly selective of crop fields and are in fact actively herded into fallow fields to feed on crop residues. During these periods, they are closer to the safety of their home enclosures and much less vulnerable to predation. So in this case, there's a complex interplay between husbandry practices and ecology and human-lion conflict. The other livestock husbandry practice that greatly influences levels of predation is protection of livestock at night. So large predators are often nocturnal. Lions and hyenas most certainly are. And particularly so when they're on farmland. So in order to avoid contact with people. And cattle are traditionally housed in protective enclosures or bomas at night to protect them from protection. And you can see a wooden stockade in this photograph. However, cattle are not always well cared for. And our data from predation records shows that the vast majority of predation incidents occur when cattle are left out in grazing areas at night, as shown by the white bar in the right panel of this graph, and that they are less often attacked during the day or when protected in a boma. So nighttime protection is really critical to reducing livestock loss. So having gained some understanding of human-lion conflict in Hwange, how does one go about mitigating it? And you'll be pleased to see a picture of an elephant rather than a lion in this slide. There are multiple approaches, which I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but they include lethal control, translocation, zoning, damage limitation through protection of crops and livestock, compensation and benefit sharing. And not all of these are appropriate in every circumstance or for all conflict species. And it really is a kind of situational kind of decision. So now I'm going to tell you about some of the lion conflict mitigation work that my team undertake. So in response to very high levels of livestock loss to local farmers, we started a program called the Long Shields Lion Guardians. And this program was modeled on the very successful Lion Guardian program in Kenya, where Maasai Morans, or warriors, who would traditionally hunt and kill lions, are co-opted to monitor and protect lions and their local communities. The Zimbabwean program is named for the local Ndeipi people, who were historically known as the people of the long shields for their tall, rawhide shields. Our Long Shields team consists of 9 men and 2 women who are hired from the local community and themselves live in the community area. Their role is to protect and warn local farmers if lions are in the area, to actively deter lions, to educate people about lions and conservation, and train people in livestock mitigation and protection strategies. And in these images, you can see the Guardian team tracking lions on the national park boundary and rescuing lost livestock that might otherwise be vulnerable to predation. So they really do provide a kind of community service that is greatly valued. And I mentioned that the Guardian team actively deter lions using non-lethal methods. The program fits GPS collars to lions living in the park periphery that might be expected to come into conflict with people. And when these lions move into community farmland, the Guardian team alert local people to bring in or guard their livestock. The team also trained to chase lions back into the protected area by creating noise and disturbance that lions dislike, known as vuvuzelas, which many of you will be familiar with. And they're often used by South African football fans at matches to make a huge amount of noise. And this noise is frequently enough to get lions moving away from livestock and human settlements. Now, I did have a video embedded in the slide of a lion chase, but I've discovered that Zoom somehow doesn't like to play it. So you're going to kind of have to imagine the kind of chaos and noise of these kind of plastic trumpets and shouting and the kind of disturbance that gets lions moving. And it really does work in chasing lions away. But, does it work? Does hazing lions work? We call it hazing, this sort of chasing behavior. And it's usually very successful at chasing lions away in the short term. And what we've done is we've evaluated the technique on GPS-collared lions over several years in a study led by doctoral student Lizanne Petrarca. And as you might expect, there are many factors that determine the success of a chase. Proximity to the park boundary being one. They're very happy to run back to the park if it's close. Small prides of lions are easier to deter, and lions from socially stable prides are easier to chase off. And season plays a big role as well, primarily because of the thick vegetation providing refuge for chased lions in the wet season. Social stability is particularly interesting, as we find that prides with cubs that have lost their territorial male, often through trophy hunting, leave the protected area to avoid infanticide by new males. And these prides are much harder to chase, as they are also avoiding interactions with other lions. And this again illustrates the complexities of conflict situations. Long-term deterrence, in other words, prevention of reoccurrence of depredation by hazed lions, depends largely on how often they are hazed to reinforce the deterrent effect, which is the top graph. So those that are often chased are less likely to reoffend. How often lions have previously killed livestock. So habitual livestock killers are much harder to deter. They will often come back. And how much time lions spend close to people. In this case, the proportion of their home range that intersected with the exclusion zone. So lions that are familiar with people are much, again, a very complex picture. So another way in which we work to reduce livestock loss and therefore reduce levels of conflict between lions and local farmers is to improve livestock enclosures or bomas. And these photographs show some of the bomas we help people build. So static defenses are shown on the left, basically chain link stockades which keep livestock at night. And on the right, communal mobile bomas that can be moved between sites. Both of these types of protective measure greatly improve the protection of livestock at night. And to date, no predator attacks have occurred at our boma sites. The chain link stockades tend to be used in Botswana, and the mobile bomas we use in Zimbabwe. So to say a bit about the communal mobile bomas, these are opaque PVC canvas screens that are sited on fallow fields. And they seem quite flimsy, but because predators can't see inside and cattle can't see out, they appear to be unwilling to challenge the walls of the boma, and they function very much like a game capture kind of boma. The cattle are kept inside the bomas at night and fertilize the soil with dung and urine, and the bomas are moved between sites every few weeks. And as you can see from these photos, the soil on the sites treated with mobile bomas is greatly improved, and crops grown on fields that have been treated are more productive and healthy. And this provides a significant benefit to farmers who use these methods, which is particularly important in an area where food insecurity is high. As you can see from these graphs, maize plants grown on treated boma sites are taller and more robust. And they produce larger cobs and more of them. And you can clearly see the difference between maize grown on treated plots on the right of this photograph and untreated plots on the left. The maize grown on treated plots is very much bigger and healthier. However, we know that people who perceive these, this might seem a long way from mitigating human-lion conflict. However, we know that people who perceive that they are receiving benefits are much more likely to tolerate the presence of wild animals, as our surveys of the factors that contribute to forming local people's attitudes to lions clearly shows. So livestock loss has also declined over time in our study sites, and this has in turn reduced the levels of illegal retaliatory killing of lions by local farmers, with 13 lions illegally killed in the 4 years before the program started, compared to only 2 in the 4 years after the program was initiated. So this is benefiting lions as well as people. And finally, the critical evidence that conflict mitigation is successful is the change in people's attitudes since we started the program. And the perceptions before and after are shown here. A survey led by Lovemore Sabanda as part of his doctoral study, and the results of which we've recently published, shows that people generally felt that livestock protection had improved as a result of the Guardian's activities, and that livestock loss had decreased. And you can see that in the 2 top bars of that figure. They also felt more positively towards lions. Understandably, people still worried about lion predation and were fearful of the dangers that lions pose to their safety. And these results suggest that the project is addressing some of the attitudinal factors that contribute to human-lion conservation conflicts. However, some of the more deep-seated attitudes to lions, such as concerns about safety, are much harder to address and require long-term engagement. So I'll end this talk with this slide showing our website and the Instagram links if you want to find out more about the project and the areas of research I've mentioned. I've hopefully given you a flavor of some of the research we've been doing, and also the challenges of managing and conserving large predators such as lions. Thanks very much for your attention and the opportunity to share my project's research. and I'll be very happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Andy, for that fascinating talk. And I think there's already a couple of questions coming through. And so I just want to ask my colleagues, Nobesuthu and Diane, to just help us with the next section of Q&A. So over to you, Nobesuthu and Diane.
Hi, thank you very much for this, MX, and thank you very much for the interesting talk, Andrew. So our first question is going to come from Marilyn. Marilyn Noms, may you please take the floor at this moment? I'm just going to let her ask the question herself.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Prof. Loveridge, for an excellent talk. I'm going to try and quickly express my question because it's thoughts I've had listening to you talk. I'm not myself in the field of carnivore conservation, so I'm a visitor with comments, and maybe you'll find questions in my comment. With the context of how communities find themselves adjacent to national parks and wildlife in Zimbabwe, the colonial history we know of displacement of communities and movement of communities to regions of poor agricultural potential that happen to also be regions of wildlife conservation, I feel that is the context in which we are having a lot of this human-wildlife conflict. But I observe that a lot of approaches in conservation and engagement with lions and elephants tend to focus a lot on conflict as the main relationship of local communities with wildlife, which is important, but I'm curious as to how you and your team are working to harness the value of lions culturally, traditionally and otherwise with the communities. I realize one of your first slides talk about the cultural value of lions in communities that haven't had lions in a long time. I'm sure they should by now within your team be an understanding of cultural value of lions to the Shonas, to the Ndebeles, the Donga, and I feel like it should be in the forefront of popularizing the conservation of lions. I know it really rakes a lot of support and donations and funding in the West, but there is also a cultural element that could speak to the conscience of locals in relating to the wildlife and in abating the conflict. I'm wondering how your team is working to harness that, also considering that Zim has very porous borders, and I personally believe a lot of the bones and poached lions that are being impounded in South Africa, some of those would probably be coming from Zimbabwe, as we've seen with leopard skins. So I feel like a lot of that poaching, Zimbabwe is a ready market for a lot of the poaching for lion skins and teeth and bones. So how are you working to harness the local cultural, intrinsic and traditional value of lions to speaking to people about it, other than just the front of conflict and conflict mitigation and so on? Maybe my last question is just a curiosity of mine. What is the status of lions in the wildlife economy, apart from just tourism? I was on a talk on the high-level panel report in South Africa here, and there's big debate and debating on lion breeding and so on. what is happening in Zimbabwe when it comes to diversifying lions as a wildlife economy. Are the people breeding lions? I know we have issues with lion volunteerism that we know of. Yeah, those are just my curiosities. Thank you.
Milan, thanks very much. Those were very insightful questions, and there's several of them. So I guess that the first question you asked is about people's traditional values, and I think, I guess as a kind of primarily a biologist, I've tended to focus on kind of wildlife issues. But what's really struck me, whenever you talk to people in the local community, they don't want to get rid of lions completely. They might not like them right by their houses, but they have a really strong valuation of wildlife. And I think, I've always thought, so much more tolerant of wildlife than, say, people in Europe would be. You can imagine that, if you wanted to introduce bears or kind of wolves to some parts of Europe where they don't have them, there would be outrage and people would be frightened and they would be complaining. African people are so tolerant of wildlife. And so there are these conflicts, but I think underlying that is a huge tolerance and a value to these animals. I guess we do need to kind of deal with the kind of the conflict, though, because this really does affect people's lives. They lose their cattle, their children are threatened, and so you have to deal with that conflict as well, which is kind of what we're doing. But it is a bit like a sticking plaster because you're not sort of dealing with some of the underlying issues, and one of those underlying issues is benefit, as you say, and a lot of the people that live around protected areas don't necessarily benefit from those protected areas. I think in our surveys we found about 18% of all the people we asked actually said they got anything out of living next to a national park. So I mean, I think in the long term that's got to change. People have to sort of be brought in and be part of that kind of benefit sharing system and be part of the wildlife economy. And I think CASA is really quite forward looking in that, CASA is a conservation area, but alongside conservation is people's livelihoods. And I think that's a really important thing to kind of be taking forward. And I think if we want long-term conservation of species like lions and elephants, we have to have that. So really critical. So I don't know if that kind of answers your question about the wildlife economy. I think it's not happening. I think people need to be much more brought into that. I'm not sure that farming lions is an answer. It has a lot of conservation kind of problems as well as generating funding and money. But certainly, tourism is a big funding engine. I mean, not so great at the moment, but I think the more you can bring local people into tourism, particularly in those kind of connectivity areas where you really want to preserve the habitat, and they're not protected habitats, they're habitats that are outside. And if we can protect those habitats by kind of getting people to involved in wildlife sort of friendly activities such as tourism, maybe even wildlife farming, those are real answers, I think. So I don't know if that kind of answers your questions there.
Thank you very much, Andy. I think that also answers Ajahn's question, which was related to lion conservation in Tanzania, where he mentions that there's value, the cultural value in lions to the Maasai community, and they seem to have an appreciation of lions, and I think that is how you've already responded to, and it's a similar question as well to what Mary had asked. And the next question, we actually have two questions from Richard. One is related to the incentives that are made available to communal farmers for them to participate or value lion conservation. Yep, so maybe you can answer that question and then we'll move to the next one after that, because these two questions are not related. Yeah.
So I think, people that live around national parks don't benefit sufficiently from wildlife, and that's a big challenge. I think in terms of kind of incentivizing people to get involved in conflict mitigation kind of programs like ours, we find that people really value it. And particularly, I think the mobile bomas are really attractive because they help people grow more food. And that's a real benefit, as well as protecting livestock. So I think those are kind of things where conservationists can sort of incentivize. But it's a much bigger issue than sort of individual conservationists can deal with. I think it's a sort of, it's a sort of national economic kind of incentive that needs to kind of happen, really. How do you kind of bring people who are marginalized into the wildlife economy? How do you get them to benefit from tourism, from trophy hunting, all those kind of things? And of course Campfire does address that to some degree.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much, Andrew, for that response. I think I was just going back to Arjun's question and listening to what you just said. And I'm just wondering as well if the perceptions towards predators then, since we're saying the communities are not benefiting, do you think that the perceptions are a function of livestock predation or related to cultural and emotional factors?
I think it's both. And I think, certainly livestock depredation causes a huge amount of trauma, and people, dislike predators for that reason. But it's not the only reason people don't like predators. They're frightened of them, actually. I think that's a really important thing. And if you live that close to predators and your children are walking to school, of course you're frightened of them. They're a cause of great concern. But what we found is that, people also value nature. And if people that value nature actually have a much more positive attitude to all kind of wildlife. And people who benefit from wildlife have a much more positive attitude. So that's really kind of where we got to go with this. People have to benefit. People need to see that they're going to get something out of this in order to tolerate dangerous species.
Right. Yeah, that's quite true, Andy, there. And I think already with the work that you're doing, there's a lot of benefits that we're seeing. Crops in the bomas that you're putting around the farm fields and all that work. I think it's actually those tangible benefits and appreciation that we're also getting from conservation work that is done in local communities. So there's a question again from Richard that he's asking to say, to what extent do grazing area degradation in communal areas contribute towards livestock encroaching into conservation areas during the farming season?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I think it depends where. So on the eastern side of the park, there's not very much encroachment of livestock into the protected area because there's historically been a very good buffalo fence, although that's degraded to some extent now. In the north of the park, the community actually have an agreement with the Forestry Commission that they're allowed to graze their livestock within the protected area. And so that does occur. But that is generally a sort of dry season grazing, actually. So in the wet season, there tends to be enough grazing within the communal area to sustain the stock. But yeah, certainly, animals that graze within the forest area are very vulnerable to predation, and we see a lot of predation in that kind of circumstance.
Okay. And then the next question is from Julian. He's saying, could captive lions, say in zoos and etc., be used to boost genetic diversity in the wild?
I think it depends on the lions, and I think a lot of zoo stock are very mixed parentage. So I think geneticists would probably say no, but I think there are some breeding programs that probably have some reasonable genetic stock that could be used. And I think particularly in places like North Africa, where pretty much they've lost all their lions, and there is some thought that zoo lions might kind of hold some of the kind of genetic sort of parentage from lions from that area, and they could be reintroduced. I think it's a very open debate, and I'm not sure that there's really the resource in conservation to kind of be thinking about that at the moment.
Yeah, that's quite interesting indeed. And I was actually also thinking, like, in terms of genetic diversity, because in your talk, you also mentioned that those areas, like the lion range areas, actually have decreased over the years, right? And if you look at protected areas in Zimbabwe, there's actually evidence that historically lions used to be culled in those areas. And I'm also thinking in terms of the genetic diversity there and what exactly the thinking was when culling was being done. I think it was in the 1960s. Would you like to comment on that, Andy?
Yeah, I think, well, predator control was quite widespread in protected areas in Southern Africa, including in Zimbabwe. So, I mean, if you read Ted Davidson's book, he was the first warden of Hwange. He talks about his kind of his experiences, hunting and killing lions in what is now a national park. And I think, we find that really surprising, but actually that was kind of, that was the way wildlife were managed in those days. And I think the thinking was that if you remove the predators, then you were protecting the herbivore species, which at the time were more valued. And I think, those kind of activities probably, decreased lion populations for sure. And they've recovered from those very low numbers in those areas.
Okay. So you're saying that at the stage, lion management, population management really might not be, it needs to be thought through, perhaps. Do you have any comments? Like, is it something that we can still do in this day and age, given that the range areas are decreasing and there's issues with human and carnivore conflict in the local communities? Do you think it's an opportunity that can be explored, or would there other ways of doing it?
Yeah, so I think if you're talking about genetics, I mean, I think what's been shown by various studies is that genetic kind of diversity in lions has declined right across the continent. So it's not just in Zimbabwe, it's also in Africa, it's right the way through. But it's, I mean, not being a geneticist, I couldn't say whether that's really problematic for lions. When they get really inbred, then you do start getting reproductive problems, and very inbred populations struggle to reproduce. So you don't want to land up in that kind of situation where you've got very, very tiny isolated populations that are likely to become inbred. At the moment, my guess is that in Southern Africa, the lion populations are big enough and connected enough that genetics is not going to be a real problem in the foreseeable future. But I think in terms of management, and you talk about opportunities, now's the opportunity. We have these landscapes already. They're there. They exist. Let's protect them as they are and try and keep them connected. In 50 years' time, it's going to be too late. So I think that is the management opportunity, really. And of course, African countries do a fantastic job of conservation already. They already invest masses of their kind of resources in setting aside these protected areas and managing them. So that needs to keep on going, and we need to be sort of cognizant of the fact that we've got to protect the habitat. Otherwise, it's going to be too late for lions and lots of other species.
That's interesting, because this is really connected to the next question that Catherine asked in the chat box. He's saying that given the high biotic pressure from surrounding communities and anthropogenic footprint as a whole, don't you think building ecological corridors throughout the large landscape could be also used for disease spillover from feral dogs and etc.? Recently, a paper documented the same thing from Florida panther population in the US. Additionally, how how the agricultural practice countries like India can be shifted into sustainable one to protect apex carnivores and grass species, grass-specific carnivore species, moving between source population and sink population. Yeah, that's Kathan from India.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, human population pressures on India are very much higher than we have in Southern Africa at the moment. So I think the challenges of connecting up protected areas are so much harder. But there is movement of animals through, between protected areas in India. So it does happen. It happens a lot more in Southern Africa, and I think we still have a permeable connected habitat over most of, at least over Kaza, perhaps not other parts of Zimbabwe and Southern Africa. I think there was a question about whether having these connectivity corridors can, I guess, precipitate sort of disease transmission. I guess it's possible, but I think that might happen anyway. And a lot of wildlife disease spills over from domestic livestock or domestic dogs. And I guess the answer really there is a veterinary one rather than a sort of landscape connectivity one.
Okay. A couple of weeks ago, we had Ken Giller, very interested in conservation and also agriculture in local communities. Ken has a question. Ken, would you like to have the floor and ask the question yourself?
Sure. Well, thanks very much. It's really fascinating to talk, Andy. I visited these areas just as a tourist, not in a professional capacity, except around Chilocho. But we did a lot of work in the Mid-Zambezi Valley, and there we saw that basically, I think in 3 years, there were 14 people killed by lion during a period we were there. And you didn't talk much about human loss of life. I wonder if that's an issue around Hwange or not.
Yeah, so I mean, there have been human fatalities around Hwange, but surprisingly few actually. I think I can only think of maybe 4 or 5 in 20 years. So it does happen, but it's not something that happens a lot. And I think in the Zambezi Valley, they had a really quite serious sort of spate of human killing by lions. And I think it was particular lions that kind of learned how to kill people. And of course, this is a big problem across Africa. In Tanzania, it's a huge problem. And I think over about 10 years in the sort of early 2000s, I think 500 people were killed by lions. So that was a huge conflict. And I think what they sort of find is that lions tend to kind of shift sort of prey and shift to kind of eating people when their natural prey is depleted. And that sort of seemed to be the kind of pattern there. And I think around Hwange, there's enough natural prey that lions don't need to really do that. Yeah,
I thought
it's certainly a big issue in some parts of Africa.
I thought the mobile boma method, I thought that looked great. So I think that's something that we could really try out elsewhere. So I thought that's really great. Thanks for the talk.
Okay, thank you very much, Ken, for joining us again for this talk. Our next question was from Winnie. So Winnie says conservationists seem very clear about landscape connectivity and the value for long-term survival of large migratory wildlife species. The land question is very much political, a political question across Africa. How can we bring the high-level political support required to make the important decision around land use planning? We may need to challenge ourselves to stop preaching to the choir. We may need to find out how to communicate to the political class. We have an agent problem here. What are your views on this, Andy?
Very good question. And I think, I sort of look to Kaza in some ways because I think Kaza is really quite novel and groundbreaking in that this is an intergovernment kind of treaty, and governments have agreed to set aside this huge conservation landscape that contains lots and lots of people as well. And I think that Kaza might be including people in land use decision making. They're talking to communities, they're including people's livelihoods in the whole conservation question. And I think there's just no question that you can exclude people from land. People are on the land, they have to be part of the conservation solution rather than seen as some sort of impediment to conservation. And I think CASA is kind of looking at it through that kind of lens, and I think that's really the right thing to be doing. And they're not easy questions, they're not easy to solve, but you're not going to solve them without talking to people living in communities in these conservation areas, and they have to be included in that, and they have to be part of any solution.
Yeah, that is very true, Angie. And what I find interesting is there's economic status in this country is quite various, and to find that maybe in Zimbabwe the economy is quite poor. So looking at the question from Ruramai is asking, how can compensation be implemented in cases of human-wildlife conflict, considering that Zimbabwe has financial constraints?
Yeah, I mean, the issue of compensations are a really tricky one. So at the moment, Zimbabwe doesn't compensate anybody for wildlife damage. And many African countries don't. Some do, like Botswana. And if you talk to wildlife officials in Botswana, they say it's the worst thing they ever did because they can't afford it. And it takes a huge amount of their kind of conservation budget. And people aren't getting fully compensated anyway. And so they're really angry. It's really not solving the problem. And compensation has other issues like the sort of perverse incentives not to look after your livestock, because if you're going to be compensated, why bother? Or and it requires a huge amount of kind of oversight from whoever's paying the compensation, because you have to check out every single incident and you verify that it was a lion or a hyena or whatever it is. So it's hugely complex to implement, and most countries that do it don't do it well, and it doesn't work. And I think even in European countries that do it, they find it really difficult. Countries like France do compensate farmers who lose, say, sheep to wolves, and they pay out vast millions and millions of euros every year, and they can afford it. African countries just can't afford it. And it's really tricky, and it seems very, very unfair, I think. But I think certainly if you talk to people in Botswana, they say, don't go down the compensation route because this has bitten us and we don't know what to do anymore.
Yeah, that's very critical and interesting. We have a question from Peter Chikada, who actually has brought up a subject that is of interest to myself. Peter, would you like to go on and ask the question yourself?
Thank you very much, Andrew, for an informative talk. My question really is around partnership. They are very critical in terms of achieving the conservation goals. But what do you consider as the challenges, and how can we solve some of these challenges in terms of getting the NGOs to work with the private sector to achieve some of our conservation objectives?
I think certainly partnerships are critical, and I think in terms of partnerships, I think as a sort of research type NGO, we have a very strong partnership with Zim Parks. I think that's a critical one. We have, in some senses, partnerships with communities, in that we work very closely with local communities, and I think those are absolutely essential. And I think that's been missing from conservation for a long time. Trying to ensure that conservation is relevant to local people and making sure that it is a partnership, and certainly those need to happen. Whether there can be partnerships sort of outside the sort of conservation sphere in terms of kind of local businesses and things, I think those can happen. And I think things like predator-friendly beef, which has been trialed a lot in Botswana, but I think could work very well in Botswana. So, and certainly in Zimbabwe. So bringing beef production to local people and benefiting local people as well as local businesses like tourism, I I think those partnerships can work. They require a lot of effort, a lot of time, and a lot of finance to set up. And I think that's really the biggest challenge for us.
So you know, whenever the private sector wants to work with NGOs, the issue of trust always come into play. Do you see this as a challenge if we're to try and get the private sector engaged in the conservation issues? Because, you know, you have these businesses in local communities, they leave it to NGOs to carry all the burden. What can we do so that we can constructively engage them and have that trust relationship? Because, you know, the NGOs, obviously they look at the private sector with a bit of, whenever they have good intentions, they judge them as not, I mean, they almost fear that they can be tarnished. But sometimes the private sector has a role to play. But also equally, the private sector, you know, you never understand their strategy and their motives. So those are sort of the questions that I sort of wanted to get insights around.
Yeah, I think that those are good questions. And I think, I mean, sort of privatization and commercialization of conservation has been tried elsewhere, and to varying degrees of success. And I think bringing sort of economy into, or economics into conservation, I think is important. You have to make it you know, economically worthwhile for people to engage in. So it needs to happen. I don't have a lot of experience with it, to be honest. So I think I'd be sort of making sort of unsubstantiated statements if I said I really knew anything about it. But certainly, you know, I think benefiting local people, bringing local people into the economy's got to happen.
Yeah, I think that's something that we're all trying to figure out, Andy, and Peter as well. There's actually an interesting, there are interesting publications out there, and something that is still being developed for conservation on what we call collective impact. So it is something that we really need, given the conservation crisis that we're facing at this stage. And I'll also probably share a publication that I also led like last year on the need for collective impact and conservation, because it still has not been explored. So there is actually a structure for that. We just have one last question from Malvin on, he's asking if we've considered having sorry, I just need to read the question again. It appears there is more specific conflict mitigation across Southern Africa, such as standalone lion or elephant conflict mitigation and etc. Have you considered a lion-elephant conflict mitigation linkage?
Yes, we just don't have the resources to make it work, but I think it would make every sense to kind of mitigate lion-elephant conflict at the same time, and other groups are doing that for sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. Oh, it's now 4:30. We're supposed to be closing.
Yeah.
I'm tempted to take, Abisha has like 2 questions that he just posted. Maybe you can take it from here, MX, and maybe highlight his questions as well. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Abisha, would you like to ask very quickly your questions, and then we can then conclude?
Oh, sorry, I just realized that he sent the message directly to me as a direct message. It says it does not have good connection, but is asking, is saying that it was good to see your program is implementing practical work on the ground, on ground solutions in dealing with human-wildlife conflict, which is great. So his question is, how sustainable are those interventions given the fact that they are dependent on NGO funding and maybe aren't self-sustaining? That's one question. Then the second one is, let's say you are asked to do or design this program or project again in the same area. What are the top 3 things that you would do differently?
So yeah, the question of sustainability first. This is a question we ask ourselves a lot because, in many ways, what we're doing is not sustainable. We're paying for boomers, we're paying people to be lion guardians. I think, in some ways, our exit strategy is really linked to some kind of sustainable wildlife economy. And I sort of mentioned predator-friendly beef. I think those kind of initiatives could be generating the kind of funding that would support this sort of program. And I think that's what we need to be looking towards. At the moment, it's not sustainable. Though, we're there for the long term, we're trying to keep the money rolling in and we're trying to keep it going. So the second question was, what would we do differently? And I'm not sure that we would do a lot that's different. I think that our approach has been to understand the conflict, and I think we got pretty far down the road of understanding it, so we'd still do that. The second thing is to engage the community, and I think to employ people from the community who are part of the community, who are respected by the community, and I think we'd still do that. So I'm not sure there's really much that we'd do very differently. And I think, so like I'm saying, I think I'm fairly satisfied with how we've done things at the moment. And I'm not sure that there would be anything we'd do very differently.
Wow, thank you very much, Andy. I'm slightly surprised that you skipped a question on Cecil the lion, and
Yes.
which has had a huge generated huge debate in the UK and on Twitter sphere. But thank you so much for your talk, which has given us lots of stuff to think about and lots of questions. I think some of the questions by Peter are worth understanding and trying to grapple with. Could we think of perhaps something that's been done for rhinos, bonds, and how investment can be generated for lions? So thank you so very much for that presentation. I just wanted to round up with a few things, but perhaps before I do that, can I ask everybody if you could take your camera off and just give Andy a virtual round of applause. And I know lots of us have been not on camera, so it would be good to get as many of you on camera and we give Andy a virtual round of applause. Please turn your camera on if you can. Wonderful, thank you very much. So there you are, Andy, and if you can, please, let's go around. Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry, Andy, because of what's happening, we can't all, you can't hear all of us, but there you are. You got your round of applause from everybody, and we really appreciate your coming and your presentation this afternoon. And
well, thank you very much.
Just to round up, I just wanted to share a few announcements for all of us, and really ask you just to bear with me one moment as I get the slides up. I just wanted to say, please do sign up as a friend, as a member. We've got a link that I've put on the chat box, zimscb.org/sign up. Please do sign up. We will keep in touch with you. And then just want to say our next seminar is set for the 26th of August. And we're very delighted to have Professor Johan Tutoi, who is a very distinguished Zimbabwean. And if you've ever been to UZ and had anything about TRAP and been to the University of Pretoria, you might have heard about Johan, and he will be talking to us about how to find a focus for conserving terrestrial biodiversity on the 26th. We really would like to encourage many of you to register. We'll be sending the link for the registration in the coming days. Future seminars, we're hoping to cover a number of topics on elephants, forests, sustainable use, invertebrates, fresh water, and we would like to encourage many of you who have suggestions for speakers or topics to really get in touch with me on that particular one. The last plug from me is about the SCBC International Congress, and that's going to be online, and we really encourage you to join and be a part of that. So thank you very much. Again, Andy, just want to say thank you for joining us. We want to acknowledge a few people. Johan is here, David is here, a lot of friends, Jill, Professor Jill Atkinson was also here, and many of you who are friends, and Peter, and it's lovely to see all of you. So look forward to having you next time. And once again, thank you, Andrew, for such an insightful and stimulating presentation, and we really thank you. Just being reminded as well, we've got Rose as well here. Thank you for coming along and joining us. So if you, wherever you are, whether it's morning, afternoon or evening, may it be good, and we look forward to seeing you next month on our next seminar. Thank you.
Thanks, MX.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, MX and Tim.
Thank you, MX.
Thanks, David.
Very enjoyable afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I sent you a message. Please do check it on the chat.
Yes, I lost it and will respond to you by email. Thank you very much. I'm very interested in what you sent.
Yes.